An entire army could be undone by a single stone falling from the wrong ceiling. The true power of a medieval castle was not in its walls, but in the hidden secrets within them. By the end of this journey, you will understand the 25 ingenious traps that decided wars and saved kingdoms. How did a simple hole in the floor become more feared than 1,000 swords? And what cunning deception turned a castle's main gate into its deadliest weapon? What does it tell you about human creativity when survival is the only goal? A castle under siege was a world under a microscope, its every weakness magnified by desperation. For the lord inside, the towering walls were not just stone but a ticking clock, measuring the dwindling supplies of food, water, and hope. His enemy outside faced a different calculus, one of dwindling morale, disease spreading through cramped camps, and the staggering cost of keeping an army idle for months on end. This was the brutal equation of medieval siege warfare, a slow, grinding contest of wills where starvation was as common a weapon as the catapult. The goal was rarely a dramatic final assault, at least not at first. It was to break the spirit, to make the defenders believe that surrender was their only path to survival. Every architectural trick, every hidden mechanism we will explore, was born from this prolonged psychological pressure. Engineers did not just build walls, they built experiences, crafting journeys for invaders that were fraught with confusion, vulnerability, and escalating dread. They weaponized the landscape itself, ensuring that any army approaching was already funneled, exhausted, and exposed before a single arrow was fired. This context transforms a simple hole in the floor from a structural oddity into a masterstroke of predatory design. It was in this high-stakes game of mental and physical endurance that the most ingenious traps were not just invented but perfected. This layered philosophy of attrition had a name, a principle borrowed from ancient generals and perfected in stone, defense in depth. Think of it not as a single wall, but as a series of ever-tightening concentric rings, each one a test of will and resources. An invading force did not simply attack a castle, they negotiated a gauntlet, a meticulously planned descent into vulnerability. The journey might begin with something as seemingly innocuous as a wide, water-filled ditch known as a moat. This was not just a barrier to slow them down, it was the first filter, forcing troops to bunch together on narrow bridges or spend precious hours and energy filling it in, all while exposed to arrows from the walls. Beyond that, a cleared killing field offered no cover, just open ground where every step forward was measured against the whistling flight of projectiles. Then came the outer wall, often lower and less formidable, designed to be breached. This was the cruel genius of the system, allowing the enemy a taste of victory only to funnel them into a far more deadly space between the outer and inner walls, a trap within a trap called the death ground. Here, exhausted and compressed, they would face fire from all sides. Each layer served a dual purpose, to physically stop the advance and, more importantly, to psychologically erode the attacking spirit. By the time a soldier reached the inner sanctum, if he ever did, he was likely exhausted, demoralized, and surrounded by the signs of his army's heavy losses. This systematic draining of hope and manpower made the castle not just a fortress, but a predatory entity that consumed armies bite by bloody bite. Every ingenious device we are about to uncover was a component of this consuming machine, a sharpened tooth in its deep, layered throat. The first layer of this consuming machine was often the most intimate and terrifying, a personal introduction to the castle's predatory nature. High above a narrow gate passage, a simple square opening was cut into the stone ceiling. To an invading soldier rushing through the breached outer gate with adrenaline pounding, it was just another architectural detail, a patch of darkness overhead. This was the murder hole, and its name was a promise. From that concealed position, defenders could unleash a calculated torrent of horror onto the cramped mass below. Rocks and heavy stones were just the beginning, meant to crush and maim, but the true ingenuity was in the substances chosen for their specific, agonizing effects. Boiling oil or water would sear through leather and cloth, causing catastrophic injury. Hot sand, a deceptively simple weapon, could pour through armor seams, causing unbearable burns and blinding men in an instant. Perhaps most feared was quicklime, a caustic powder that, when combined with the moisture in eyes or lungs, could create severe chemical reactions. The psychological mastery here was absolute. Attackers were already vulnerable, compressed by the narrow passage and focused on the threat ahead. The assault from above was sudden, unseen, and inescapable. It transformed a corridor, a path to the castle's heart, into a vertical tomb. This trap did not just inflict loss, it shattered morale. It taught a brutal lesson that within these walls there was no safe angle of approach, and that the very architecture was an active participant in the fight. The murder hole was a stark declaration that the castle itself was watching, and it was not merely a shelter but a hunter. That vertical tomb needed a door to seal it shut. The Portcullis was that door, but it was never meant to be closed gently. Imagine a massive grid of iron-tipped oak, weighing as much as several horses, suspended by chains high within a stone archway. To an attacking force surging through an open gate, it was merely a shadowed ceiling, an architectural detail lost in the chaos of the charge. Its operation was a secret kept in a chamber above, where a single guard stood by a heavy lever or a winch mechanism. With one decisive action, the chains were released. There was no slow descent, only a thunderous, instantaneous drop. The sound alone was a weapon, a deafening crash that signaled not just a blocked path, but a catastrophic change in fortune. Its primary genius was surgical. It acted like a blade cutting through the body of an advancing army, cleanly severing the leading warriors from the main force now trapped outside. The vanguard, the bravest and most experienced fighters, suddenly found themselves not in a conquered gateway, but in a stone cage. The open passage behind them was now a wall of iron lattice, and the space ahead remained barred by the castle's inner doors. They were caught in a perfect, man-made purgatory known as the gatehouse. This was the moment the castle's design shifted from defense to active hunting. The murder holes in the ceiling above, which we just discussed, now had a captive audience. The trapped soldiers, packed tightly with no room to wield their weapons or raise their shields, could do little but look up as the darkness above them came alive. The Portcullis transformed the gatehouse from a passageway into a killing bottle, allowing defenders to methodically address the threat within. This combination of traps represented a chilling efficiency. Why waste energy fighting an entire army in the open when you could isolate its spearhead and eliminate it at your convenience? The crashing finality of the Portcullis taught a harsh lesson about momentum. In siege warfare, forward movement was life, and anything that could stop that movement so absolutely held a psychological power far beyond its physical weight. It was a reminder that every entrance offered was also a potential conclusion. That pre-arranged zone of annihilation had a name, and it stood boldly outside the castle walls as a dare. The Barbican was not a subtle trap, it was a proud declaration of hostile intent. Imagine a stone fortress built not to house lords or soldiers, but to serve as a singular, deadly instrument. It was a detached gateway, a fortified island connected to the main castle only by a narrow, exposed bridge. To an attacking army, its presence presented a tantalizing and frustrating puzzle. The main castle gate lay just beyond it, seemingly within reach, but to get there, you had to go through this smaller, stubborn fortress first. This was the genius of the invitation, the architectural deception that made the Barbican so lethal. It did not try to look weak, it looked like a challenge that could be overcome, a first victory on the path to the greater prize. Commanders would commit their best troops and heaviest siege engines to break down its outer door, believing that with its fall, the path to the castle proper would be open. What they won, however, was not a passage but a prescription for disaster. The moment that outer door was breached, the true function of the Barbican activated. Attackers would pour into a narrow, walled corridor, a stone throat only wide enough for a few men to walk abreast. They were now in the killing alley. The walls to their left and right were not solid. They were perforated with narrow vertical slits called arrow loops, and the ceiling above was dotted with murder holes. From these hidden positions, defenders could unleash a horizontal and vertical storm of projectiles into the compressed mass below. The attackers' own momentum, their push to get through the bottleneck, worked perfectly against them, packing them tighter into the zone where every shot found a target. There was no room to raise a siege ladder against the inner walls, no space to swing a battering ram, only a desperate forward scramble into a converging field of fire from three sides. The Barbican was a masterpiece of controlled engagement. It allowed the defenders to fight on their own terms from complete cover against an enemy stripped of all tactical options. It transformed the attackers' greatest asset, their numbers and their aggressive spirit, into their greatest liability. By the time any survivors stumbled out the far end, if any did, they were not a coherent fighting force, but a shattered remnant facing the still closed and heavily defended main gate. The Barbican taught a brutal lesson in medieval warfare, that sometimes the most dangerous door is the one that willingly lets you in. The iconic image of boiling oil poured from the ramparts is a powerful truth, but the reality was even more resourceful and terrifying. While precious cooking oil was sometimes used, defenders more commonly turned to a thick, sticky substance known as pitch or tar, a byproduct of wood or coal that was far more readily available in large quantities. This material was not simply dumped over the side from a bucket that would be wasteful and imprecise. Instead, castles were equipped with special stone gutters or wooden projections called hoardings that extended out from the wallwalk. These acted as precise delivery systems, allowing the defenders to position themselves directly above the attackers while remaining under cover. The process was a calculated ritual. Large cauldrons would be heated over fires on the battlements, the thick pitch bubbling and releasing an acrid, unmistakable smell that would drift down to the men below long before the attack began. This was psychological warfare in its purest form, a sensory warning of what was to come. When the moment arrived, the scalding liquid was poured not onto the ground, but targeted with chilling accuracy at the wooden siege ladders and the crowded platforms of siege towers. The effect was catastrophic. The substance did not just burn, it clung. It would seep through the gaps in plate armor, adhere to leather and cloth, and cause injuries that were often beyond the medical knowledge of the time to treat effectively. But the horror did not end with the initial cascade. Often, defenders would follow the pitch with a flaming torch or a lit arrow. In an instant, the sticky coating would ignite, transforming a section of the wall into a roaring, vertical inferno. Men, ladders, and even entire wooden siege engines could be consumed in this sudden wall of fire. The strategic brilliance was in its targeted economy. It turned the castle's greatest vulnerability, the vertical face that attackers sought to climb, into its most active defense. The sizzling sound of the liquid meeting cold stone or metal, combined with the unmistakable cries from below, served as a potent deterrent to any soldier waiting his turn at the base of the wall. This trap demonstrated that in the calculus of siege defense, even the most basic elemental forces, heat and fire, could be harnessed and directed with devastating, demoralizing precision. It asked a simple, dreadful question of every attacker looking up: is reaching the top of this wall worth becoming part of the fuel that guards it? Fire could cleanse a wall, but the ground itself could be made treacherous with a quieter, more insidious cruelty. After the roaring chaos of burning pitch, an army's advance might be met with an eerie silence, a seemingly clear path forward across a field or through a darkened gateway. This was the moment for a weapon of pure, patient malice, the Caltrop. Its design was an exercise in geometric spite, a small iron object forged with 4 sharp spikes arranged so that, no matter how it was thrown to the ground, one spike would always point defiantly upward. It was a weapon that did not need an operator, only gravity and the inevitable forward momentum of the enemy. Deployed by defenders under cover of darkness or scattered in the muddy approach trenches, these metal seeds transformed open ground into a field of hidden agony. A soldier charging across what looked like safe terrain would suddenly feel a piercing jolt through the sole of his leather boot, the sharp point driving deep into his foot. The immediate effect was a crippling injury, dropping a man to the ground in shocked pain. But the greater genius was in the cascading chaos that followed. A cavalry charge, the medieval equivalent of a tank assault, could be utterly broken as war horses, far more sensitive in their hooves, stepped on these devices. A wounded horse would rear and panic, throwing its rider and scattering the formation behind it into disarray. The Caltrop Field acted as a silent, area-denying sentry. It forced an entire army to slow to a cautious, agonizing crawl, their eyes fixed on the dirt, their formation broken as they tried to pick a safe path through an invisible forest of metal. This shifted the psychological advantage completely. Instead of focusing on the castle walls and the defenders upon them, the attackers were now preoccupied with the very ground beneath their feet, a space that should have been safe. It introduced a pervasive, low-level dread, the constant threat of a sudden, laming pain that could strike at any step. This simple iron object showcased how medieval warfare sought to weaponize every element of the environment, turning even the earth into an ally. It asked a demoralizing question of every advancing soldier: can you fight a battle when you cannot even trust the ground you stand on? A field of iron spikes taught soldiers to fear the earth, but the water itself could be just as treacherous. The drawbridge was the castle's formal handshake, its wooden face the only promise of entry across the forbidding moat. To an attacking army that had survived the killing ground and the arrow storms, its lowered position seemed like a final, merciful concession, a sign that the defenders' will was breaking. They would surge forward, a tide of armored men funneling onto that wooden platform, their focus locked on the gatehouse tunnel ahead. This was the precise moment the castle's engineers had been waiting for. With a deafening crack of shearing ropes or the groan of heavy machinery, that promise was violently revoked. The entire bridge could be designed to collapse at its center, sending a dozen men plunging into the murky water below. More cunning still were counterweighted designs built like giant seesaws. When the weight of the assault force reached a critical point on the outer half, the inner end, held down by a massive hidden weight, would drop, catapulting everyone on the platform upwards and backwards into the moat. The disaster did not end with the fall. This water was seldom clean, often stagnant and deliberately fouled. It was a breeding ground for illness, and a heavy suit of armor turned from protection into an anchor. A soldier could find himself trapped beneath the surface, entangled in debris, or struggling against the weight of his own gear in a toxic slurry. The psychological impact was profound. It transformed the moat from a simple obstacle into an active participant in the defense, a liquid trap waiting beneath a false floor. This mechanism exploited the most basic human instinct in an assault, the drive to rush through an opening. It demonstrated that in a siege, the most obvious path forward was often the most carefully engineered dead end. The drawbridge was the ultimate lesson in deceptive hospitality, a reminder that sometimes the door held open for you is only open so it can be slammed shut with you still on the threshold. Even the sturdiest shield could be rendered useless by a clever angle. After facing fire, water, and treacherous ground, an attacking force would naturally adapt, bringing forward their own mobile shelters, large wooden shields on wheels known as mantlets. These portable walls allowed sappers and archers to approach the castle's base with a comforting, if fragile, sense of security. They believed the stone face above them was inert, a passive barrier they could work against in relative safety. This assumption was their final mistake. The castle's architects had already planned for this moment of adaptation, embedding a solution within the very fabric of the walls. The narrow vertical openings known as arrow slits or embrasures were far more than simple holes. Their external face was a thin cut in the stone, difficult for an outside archer to hit, but the internal chamber flared out into a wide recess. This allowed a defender inside to stand back, draw their bow, and have a sweeping field of view while presenting a minuscule target. But the true ingenuity was in their placement and orientation. Not all arrow slits stared straight out across the field. Many were carefully angled downward, drilled through the masonry at a steep incline. From the attacker's perspective, huddled behind their mantlet, the wall above them was blank and solid. They could not see the defender who had now taken position in the chamber behind that angled slit. With calm precision, that defender could aim their arrow not at the shield, but at the ground just in front of it, or at the vulnerable feet and lower legs of the men crouching behind. The bolt would zip out from an invisible point in the stone, striking from a direction the shield was never designed to cover. This was a silent, surgical countermeasure. It turned the castle's defensive shell into an active, predatory surface. A soldier who had survived the open field and the boiling pitch only to find shelter would suddenly be struck by an attack that seemed to come from the very earth or the wall itself. It negated his technology, invalidated his cleverness, and reintroduced a feeling of absolute exposure. This endless cycle of measure and countermeasure, of shield and angled slit, defines the cold intellect of siege warfare. It was a three-dimensional game of chess played in stone and blood, where every new protection invented by the attacker was met with a new vulnerability engineered by the defender. The lesson was clear: in the shadow of a great fortress, there was no such thing as true cover, only angles you had not yet considered. Angles could be defeated, but human nature itself was the most predictable weakness of all. After facing a fortress of converging fire and deceptive openings, any commander would be desperate for a simpler solution, a back door, a forgotten passage that promised to bypass the nightmare of the main gate. The castle's architects knew this desperation intimately, and they built a trap specifically to feed it. This was the Postern gate, a small, unassuming door often hidden in a shadowed corner of the curtain wall. Its legitimate purpose was practical, allowing messengers to slip out or small groups to launch surprise raids. But in the hands of a cunning defender, it became the most seductive of lures. The trick was in its presentation. While the main gates thundered with the sounds of battle, the postern might be left conspicuously, yet subtly, vulnerable. Perhaps its portcullis appeared jammed, or its guards seemed fewer and less vigilant. Scouts would report this seeming flaw, and the attacking commander would see not a door but a shortcut, a chance to win glory and end the siege with one bold stroke. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. The eager assault force, believing they had outsmarted the defense, would funnel through the narrow opening only to find themselves not in a courtyard, but in a confined stone pen. The gate behind them would slam shut, often operated from a hidden chamber, cutting off their retreat. Suddenly, the walls of this dead-end courtyard, which had seemed empty, would bristle with archers appearing from concealed galleries. Or from hidden sally ports in the surrounding walls, a company of the castle's freshest, most heavily armored knights would charge into the compressed and disoriented invaders. The psychological cruelty was exquisite. It punished not just aggression but cleverness. It took the attacker's own desire for a tactical masterpiece and turned it into the blueprint for their own entrapment. The Postern Gate ambush was a lesson in the darker arts of warfare, proving that the most dangerous door in any fortress was not the one that was strongest, but the one that was carefully, deliberately left weak. It asked a haunting question of every ambitious commander: is that open path a gift from fortune, or a script written for you by your enemy? That seductive back door proved the castle's mind was its greatest weapon, but its first physical statement was a boundary of pure, cold intent. The moat was far more than a wide, muddy ditch. It was a carefully engineered declaration of isolation. To an approaching army, it presented a simple, daunting problem of physics. A deep channel of water, often kept deliberately stagnant, created a chasm that siege towers could not cross and battering rams could not reach. It forced every attacker into a bottleneck, onto narrow, vulnerable bridges, or into the slow, exhausting work of filling it with earth and rubble under a hail of arrows. Yet its true horror lay beneath the surface, in the details invisible from a distance. Some moats were excavated with sides as steep and slick as glass, their banks lined with timber or stone to prevent any purchase. A fully armored knight who stumbled into those waters faced a struggle beyond strength, his metal shell transforming from protection into a leaden coffin, dragging him down into the murk as he scrambled for a hold that did not exist. In other castles, the water concealed a forest of sharpened stakes, planted just below the surface to impale any man or horse that plunged in. Perhaps most cunning were moats connected to nearby streams or mill races through hidden sluice gates. Defenders could allow the water level to appear normal, even tempt attackers to begin crossing in shallow areas, only to open the gates upstream. A sudden, powerful surge would flood the channel, sweeping away equipment and men in a cold, unexpected torrent. This transformed the moat from a static obstacle into an active, unpredictable force. It set the psychological stage for everything that followed, teaching the first and most fundamental lesson of the siege, that nothing here was as it seemed, and every element of the landscape, even the water that reflected the fortress walls, had been bent to a single defensive purpose. The moat asked a silent, chilling question before a single arrow was fired. Are you prepared to drown before you even begin to fight? The moat's silent question was answered by a bridge that moved with a mind of its own. The turning bridge, also called a tipping or bascule bridge, was a masterpiece of mechanical ambush. Unlike a traditional drawbridge that lifted vertically, this device was engineered around a central pivot point, like a giant seesaw built into the gatehouse itself. To an assault force, it appeared identical to any other wooden crossing, a solid platform leading to their goal. They would charge onto it, their weight concentrated on the outer half reaching over the water. This was precisely what the defenders, hidden in the chamber above, were waiting for. With a sharp release of a hidden counterweight, the entire mechanism would come alive. The inner end, loaded with tons of stone or lead, would drop with tremendous force. This action caused the outer end, where the attackers stood, to snap upward with whiplash speed. The effect was not a simple drop into the moat, it was a violent, catapulting ejection. Men were thrown backward into the water, or smashed forward against the unforgiving stone of the gatehouse facade with bone-breaking force. The genius was in its compound impact. It did not just remove the bridge, it used the attackers' own momentum and collective weight against them in a sudden, shocking reversal of physics. A tightly packed group could be incapacitated in a single, deafening moment. This trap served as the ultimate expression of the castle's deceptive nature. It taught a visceral lesson that no surface was stable, no promise of passage was secure, and that the architecture itself could become a weapon of blunt, brutal force at any second. It kept invaders in a state of perpetual uncertainty, wondering if the very ground they stood on was about to betray them. The turning bridge taught invaders to fear the very ground beneath their feet, a lesson that was reinforced from an even more intimate and disorienting angle. While the threat from above was a known terror, the architecture of fear had a more subtle, downward gaze. In certain fortified gatehouses and towers, the wooden floorboards of an upper chamber were not solid, but punctuated by carefully constructed openings. To a defender standing in that room, they were simple hatches, often concealed by a loose rug or a movable section of planking. To an attacker below who had just battered his way through an outer door, they were invisible sentences of doom. Imagine the scene: a group of soldiers, breathing hard from their exertions, finally standing in a stone passageway thinking the immediate fight was ahead of them. Their world was a tunnel of forward momentum. Then, without warning, the ceiling above them, which they had assumed was just another floor for the defenders, would come alive. Rocks, heavy jars of quicklime, or even simply large volumes of scalding liquid would pour down from this unseen source. The attack came not from the walls they faced, nor from the gate behind them, but from the very architecture that formed their shelter. This was the floor murder hole, and its psychological impact was uniquely corrosive. It completely inverted the natural human sense of security. A room captured was not a sanctuary. It was a potential coffin with a permeable roof. It meant that every forward advance had to be checked not just for enemies ahead and to the sides, but also for the silent, structural threat from the level above. This turned the linear progression of a siege into a dizzying, three-dimensional puzzle. A soldier could not simply clear a corridor and move on. He had to constantly consider the vertical space, wondering if the chamber he just secured was merely the antechamber to another attack from an unseen floor. This trap exemplified the defensive philosophy of total environmental control, ensuring that an invader never, for a single moment, felt truly in command of any space he occupied. It whispered a dreadful truth that within these walls, safety was an illusion crafted by your own assumptions, and those assumptions could be the death of you. A castle's wooden galleries could become its final, falling shield. These structures, known as hoardings, were built as temporary wooden extensions jutting out from the stone battlements. Their purpose was practical, giving defenders a covered platform to stand on so they could lean out and fire arrows or drop stones directly down the vertical face of their own walls, targeting attackers at the very base where the stone was blind. They were a layer of active, projecting defense, but in the calculus of total war, even these protective shells held a darker, final potential. When a siege reached its most desperate climax, when enemy siege towers rolled against the walls and battering rams pounded the gates in a relentless rhythm, the hoarding itself could be transformed. Defenders would retreat from the wooden gallery and with a deliberate, grim resolve set it ablaze. The fire would catch quickly, fed by the dry timber, turning the defensive cover into a roaring torch. Then, with a shattering groan, the supports would give way. The entire burning mass, a waterfall of flame and splintered beams, would collapse directly onto the siege engines and the densely packed troops below. This was not merely dropping rocks, it was sacrificing a part of the castle's own body to create a cataclysm. The effect was both physical and psychological, a firestorm that could consume wooden towers and scatter a human tide in an instant of terrifying, sacrificial brilliance. It demonstrated a chilling principle that in the defense of a kingdom, no resource was too precious to be weaponized, not even the very structure that protected you moments before. This trap asked the ultimate question of an invader: what are you prepared to face from an enemy who is willing to burn their own house down around you? The burning hoardings lit the sky, but the most critical battles were often fought in absolute darkness, far beneath the feet of the armies above. When stone proved too strong to break, attackers turned to the earth itself, employing a slow, secretive strategy known as mining or sapping. Teams of specialized engineers, called sappers, would begin digging a tunnel from the safety of their own lines, its path carefully calculated to reach directly beneath a castle's cornerstone or a vulnerable section of wall. Their goal was to hollow out a chamber, support it with wooden timbers, and then set a massive fire. As the supports burned away, the tons of masonry above would collapse into the void, creating a breach. It was a plan of brilliant subterranean sabotage, yet for every action in siegecraft, there existed an equal and opposite reaction waiting in the shadows. The castle's defenders were not passive observers to this underground threat. They would post sentries with their ears pressed to the ground or against large drums placed on the floors, listening for the faint, telltale scrape of picks and shovels echoing through the soil. Once a mining operation was detected, the real trap was sprung. The defenders would begin digging their own tunnel, not to escape, but to intercept. This was the countermine, a silent, gritty race against time and geometry in a world of suffocating blackness. The moment their tunnel broke into the enemy sapper's passage was one of surreal and terrifying intimacy. After days of listening to muffled sounds, they would suddenly be face to face with their counterparts in a cramped earthen tube. The confrontation that followed was a masterclass in turning an enemy's strength against him. Sometimes, the defenders would simply collapse the roof of the enemy tunnel with a calculated explosion or by pulling out its supports, burying the sappers and their work in an instant. Other times, they might unleash a torrent of water from a diverted moat or cistern, flooding the narrow passage and drowning the operation in cold, muddy silence. Or they could fill the space with acrid smoke from a fire, driving the attackers back choking and blinded. The most direct method was a brutal, close-quarters fight in a space where no sword could be properly swung. A desperate struggle in the dark where daggers, short picks, and sheer terror decided the outcome. This underground warfare demonstrated that a castle's dominion extended not just over the land, but deep into the very earth it stood upon. The countermine turned the attackers' prized tools of concealment and surprise into a claustrophobic tomb of their own making, proving that no strategy was safe from a defender who was willing to listen and then dig a darker, more cunning answer. The darkness of the countermine was a war of inches, but the final defense was often a brutal, sunlit tangle of wood and iron. When a section of wall finally crumbled under the relentless pounding of siege engines, it created a moment of supreme crisis and fleeting opportunity. The attackers would see a ragged opening, a gateway to victory, and pour toward it in a roaring, chaotic mass. This was the precise moment for a defender's last, desperate card, the Spiked Chevaux-de-Frise. Far from a complex machine, its power lay in terrifying simplicity. Imagine a heavy wooden beam, as thick as a tree trunk, studded along its length with long, sharpened iron spikes radiating in every direction like the quills of some monstrous creature. Several of these would be rolled or carried into the breach itself, their interlocking spikes creating an instant, impassable thicket. Against a cavalry charge, the effect was catastrophic. A warhorse at full gallop could not simply stop, and the sight of this spiked wall appearing in a cloud of dust would cause panicked rearing or a disastrous collision, turning the knight's greatest asset into a tangle of screaming animals and fallen riders. For infantry, the obstacle was equally formidable. To advance, they would have to slowly, painstakingly navigate through a forest of piercing metal, each step a potential lancing wound, all while exposed to archers and defenders regrouping behind the barrier. The Chevaux-de-Frise was modular and adaptive, a physical manifestation of the defender's resilience. It could be deployed not just at breaches, but across gateways, narrow streets, or any point where the defensive line had grown thin. It served as a brutal reset button, transforming a sudden, dynamic breach back into a static, grinding problem for the attackers to solve under fire. This trap asked the most direct question of all in those final, breathless moments. You have broken our stone, but are you willing to bleed your way through the iron we grow in its place? That final, brutal question of iron was answered by the deceptive silence of an open space. After the deafening chaos of a breached wall, after the desperate scramble through spiked barriers, a soldier might finally stumble into a wide, sunlit courtyard. He had reached the castle's heart, the very objective of the assault, and for a moment the world seemed to fall quiet. The stone underfoot was smooth, the sky above was clear, and the high walls surrounding him appeared still and empty. This was the killing ground, and its psychological genius was absolute. It offered the illusion of sanctuary, the promise of a staging area to regroup and push deeper, but it was in fact a panoramic tomb. The walls that encircled this open space were not inert barriers. They were layered with galleries and honeycombed with arrow slits on every level, from the ground floor up to the highest battlements. The moment a critical mass of invaders poured into this courtyard, the silence shattered. From every direction, from slits they could not even see, a converging storm of arrows and bolts would descend. There was no cover, no doorway to hide in, no angle that was safe. A soldier could press his back against one wall, only to be struck by fire from the opposite side and the towers above. The courtyard's very openness, which felt like relief, was its core weapon, ensuring that every arrow found a target and no shield could protect against the onslaught from all sides. This architectural design taught a grim and counterintuitive lesson about ambition in warfare. The greatest danger was not always the obstacle in front of you, but the empty space you fought so hard to reach. It transformed the prize itself into the trap, making the moment of apparent victory the moment of ultimate vulnerability. The killing ground was a masterful study in human expectation, proving that sometimes the most terrifying place in a fortress is the one with no walls left to break. That panoramic tomb of the courtyard offered no shelter from the arrows above, but sometimes the most effective attacks were not about piercing armor, but about transforming it into an instrument of agony. While boiling oil captures the popular imagination, defenders often turn to far more accessible and insidious substances, unleashing a form of medieval chemical warfare from their murder holes. Heated sand gathered from the very earth surrounding the castle was a weapon of brutal simplicity. When poured from a great height, it did not simply fall. It flowed like a liquid, seeking out every gap and seam in a soldier's protection. The granules would pour into the neck of a breastplate, down a sleeve, or through the visor of a helmet. The initial sensation was a scalding rain, but the true horror unfolded in the seconds that followed. The sand did not cool quickly. It retained its heat, continuing to burn against trapped skin. Worse, it absorbed moisture, becoming a heavy, abrasive paste that made movement a grinding torture. A knight could find himself immobilized, his armor transformed from a protective shell into a personal oven lined with searing grit. The psychological impact was profound, as the very equipment designed to save a life now conspired to inflict a slow, inescapable pain. But an even more feared substance was quicklime, a white powder made from burnt limestone. To the untrained eye, it might look like harmless flour or ash, which was part of its deceptive danger. When poured down upon men below, it would coat their armor and cling to their skin. At first contact, it was merely an irritant, a dusty nuisance. The catastrophe began when it met moisture, which was inevitable in the heat of battle. Sweat on the brow, water in the eyes, or a stumble into the moat. The chemical reaction was violent and exothermic. The powder would combine with the water to create a corrosive, burning paste that could cause severe damage to eyes and skin. The effect was not a clean cut or a blunt impact, but a searing, chemical agony that felt like the very air was attacking the flesh. Panic was the immediate and intended result. A soldier blinded and in burning pain was completely combat ineffective, and his desperate cries and thrashing would spread disorder through the entire ranks around him. The strategic brilliance of these materials lay in their economy and psychological terror. They were cheap, available in large quantities, and required no precious resources like oil. They allowed a handful of defenders to disable dozens of attackers without ever crossing swords, turning the castle's architecture into a delivery system for a silent, creeping torment. This approach shifted the focus from defeating the soldier to defeating his spirit, asking a dreadful question of every man in armor below: what good is your steel if the air itself can be made to burn you? Even the air could be made a weapon, but the castle's most intimate treachery was woven into the very steps you walked upon. Spiral staircases, the twisting arteries connecting the floors of a great keep, were masterpieces of controlled asymmetry. Almost universally, they were built to ascend in a clockwise direction. This was not an aesthetic choice, but a coldly calculated advantage for the defenders stationed above. Picture a right-handed attacker, which most soldiers were, forced to climb such a staircase with his sword arm, his dominant side, pressed tightly against the central stone column. To swing his weapon effectively, he would have to awkwardly contort his body across the narrow, curving space, his blows hampered and weak. The defender descending from above, however, had his right arm on the open, outer side of the staircase, granting him a full, powerful arc for every downward strike. He fought with the geometry of the space as his ally, while the invader wrestled against it with every step, but the staircase held secrets beyond this handed bias. Some steps were crafted with a more insidious subtlety. In the gloom of a tight spiral, a climber's rhythm depended on muscle memory, expecting each step to rise to a consistent height. A master builder could disrupt this rhythm by inserting a single step slightly taller than the others, or one that was unexpectedly shallow. In the heat of a frantic ascent, this irregularity was a tripwire for the feet, causing a stumble that could send a man pitching backwards into the comrades behind him, creating a cascading tumble of armored bodies in the confined shaft. The ultimate deception, however, was structural. Certain staircases were built with a fatal flaw known only to the castle's garrison. A key wooden support, concealed within the stonework, could be removed by a defender from a hidden access panel. With a sharp crack, a whole section of the staircase would simply give way, collapsing into a jagged chasm. Soldiers who had fought their way to what they believed was the threshold of victory would find the floor beneath them vanish, plummeting down the stone tube to be broken by the fall or crushed by the debris. This trap embedded existential risk into the most fundamental act of conquest, moving upward. It transformed the castle's internal journey from a physical challenge into a psychological gauntlet, where trust in the very architecture was a fatal error. Every footfall became a question, every handhold a potential betrayal. The collapsing staircase whispered a final, intimate warning to any who entered the keep's heart, that here, even the act of walking could be a prelude to a fall. A staircase could collapse beneath you, but a wall could hold a silent, patient sentinel with an arrow already nocked. Beyond the simple arrow slits manned by watchful archers, some castles incorporated a more chilling innovation: mechanical arrow traps. These were not mere holes in the stone, but complex devices of wood, sinew, and metal cleverly concealed within the fabric of the walls themselves. Imagine a heavy crossbow, pre-loaded and cocked, mounted inside a hollow chamber with its bolt aimed through a disguised aperture. Its trigger was not a finger, but a cleverly disguised mechanism, perhaps a tripwire stretched across a dark corridor or a pressure plate hidden under a flagstone in a seemingly empty passageway. The principle was one of automated ambush. A lone soldier, perhaps separated from his unit while searching for a way deeper into the keep, would round a blind corner. His foot would brush against a nearly invisible cord or step on a loose stone that sank a fraction of an inch. In that instant, with a sharp thwack from the wall itself, a bolt would fire with deadly force from a point he never even saw. There was no archer to target, no cry of warning, just the sudden, impersonal violence of the architecture. For a garrison stretched thin by a prolonged siege, these devices were invaluable force multipliers. They could cover vulnerable approaches, guard less defended rear passages, or protect a corridor while the real soldiers were needed elsewhere on the ramparts. They conserved the defenders' most precious resource, their own energy and numbers, while forcing the invaders to expend theirs in constant, nerve-wracking vigilance. But perhaps their greatest power was psychological. They introduced a new layer of paranoia into the already terrifying environment of a castle assault. It meant that even when a hallway appeared deserted, when no human sound could be heard, the space itself might be armed and waiting. The castle was no longer just a shell defended by men. It was becoming an entity with a will of its own, capable of striking back autonomously. This shift from manned defense to mechanized trap represents a fascinating early step in the long journey toward autonomous warfare, a cold reminder that human ingenuity, when focused on protection, will always seek to build a guardian that never sleeps. The silent sentinels in the walls were a prelude to a far more thunderous secret buried in the earth itself. As gunpowder began to echo across the battlefields of the later medieval period, defensive engineers saw not just a new weapon for attack, but a terrifying new possibility for automated area denial. This was the Fougasse, a word that whispered of the ground itself erupting in fury. It was an early, brutal form of the landmine, a trap that stored its destructive power with patient, subterranean malice. The construction was a grim art. Engineers would dig a large, angled pit facing a likely approach path, a breach point, or a narrow gateway. This pit was not left empty. It was packed with a devastating harvest of loose stones, scrap metal, and broken masonry. At the rear of this mass, a carefully measured charge of black powder was placed, connected to a fuse that ran back to the defenders' lines. The entire assembly was then camouflaged with a thin layer of soil and debris, making it invisible to any advancing soldier. The Fougasse did not wait for an enemy to step on it. That technology was still centuries away. Instead, it was a weapon of precise, catastrophic timing, detonated by a watching defender at the perfect psychological and tactical moment. Imagine a wave of attackers surging through a newly made breach in the wall, their shouts of triumph filling the air as they poured into the space beyond. Just as their numbers reached a peak, a defender hidden in a nearby bastion would touch a flame to the fuse. From the ground directly ahead of them, the earth would heave and then vanish in a roar of smoke and flame. The angled pit acted like the barrel of a colossal shotgun, directing the blast and its deadly cargo of stone shrapnel in a wide, sweeping arc across the killing zone. The effect was not merely explosive, it was shrapnel-based, turning ordinary rubble into a storm of high-velocity projectiles that could cut through ranks of men with horrifying efficiency. The Fougasse represented a fundamental shift in defensive philosophy. It moved beyond reacting to an attack and into the realm of pre-positioning absolute devastation. It asked a new and dreadful question of every soldier crossing open ground. What if the very earth you are marching over is not ground, but a loaded weapon waiting for the spark? This trap marked the moment when castle defense began to harness the raw, impersonal power of chemistry, proving that the greatest threats were no longer always the ones you could see coming from the walls above, but the ones sleeping silently beneath your feet. The earth could be made to erupt, but the most brilliant traps were often the ones you saw and coveted. In the grand chessboard of a castle's design, a truly cunning engineer did not just build strong walls, they built one intentionally weak one. This was not a flaw, but a lure, a piece of strategic theater performed in stone and mortar. From a distance, a surveying commander might notice a section of the curtain wall that seemed shorter, or perhaps its masonry appeared less finished, its stones more crudely set. It might lack the intimidating overhangs of the neighboring towers, presenting a smoother, more scalable face. To an army desperate for a point of entry, this spot shone like a beacon, whispering promises of a quicker, less costly victory. It became the focal point for the entire siege, the place where every catapult was aimed and every ladder was built. The defenders, of course, had written this script. They had deliberately constructed this sweet spot to be irresistible, channeling the entire chaotic energy of the assault toward a single, predetermined stage. What the attackers could not see from their lines was the hidden geography behind that tempting wall. When their rams finally shattered it or their ladders topped its crest, they did not pour into a bustling courtyard or a vulnerable street. Instead, they stumbled into a vast, silent killing ground, an arena deliberately kept clear and deep. Or worse, they would find their hard-won breach merely opened onto the face of a second, taller, and completely unexpected inner wall, a sheer cliff of fresh stone rising behind the one they had just sacrificed so much to overcome. The psychological devastation in that moment was absolute. Every ounce of effort, every loss sustained in the assault, was rendered meaningless in a single, crushing revelation of deception. This grand misdirection allowed the garrison to concentrate every defensive resource, every hidden archer and stockpiled projectile on that one funnel. They did not have to defend a mile of wall, they only had to defend the 50 feet they had secretly chosen for the enemy's destruction. The trap transformed the attackers' greatest strength, their focused might, into their single point of catastrophic failure. It asked a haunting question about perception in warfare. When you find the weak spot in your enemy's armor, how can you ever be sure it wasn't placed there for you to find? That systematic dismantling of an army reached its chilling apex not in a single moment, but in a carefully orchestrated sequence. The most advanced gatehouses evolved beyond a single crashing portcullis, engineering a trap of such methodical cruelty it functioned like a stone stomach digesting its prey. This was the portcullis crush chamber, a multi-stage mechanism of pure, calculated annihilation. The process began with a familiar, thunderous drop, the first iron grate slamming down behind the leading wave of elite attackers, the knights and champions who had pushed deepest into the gate tunnel. Their initial reaction might even be one of grim determination, a belief they were now committed to a final, glorious push forward. But then came the second, sickening crash as a second portcullis, hidden further ahead, dropped to seal the passage in front of them. In an instant, forward momentum became absolute confinement. These warriors now stood not in a corridor, but in a sealed stone box, a perfect cell carved from the castle's own gateway. The crushing sound of the second grate was the sound of all options vanishing. Then the architecture itself began to speak. From the ceiling, the murder holes would open, raining down the familiar horrors of heavy stones and searing substances. But the true refinement was in the walls, which now sprouted smaller, horizontal slits. From these, defenders could thrust spears and poles into the compressed mass, or fire crossbows at point-blank range into the trapped, struggling men. There was no room for a heroic last stand, no space to swing a great sword. The crushed chamber transformed the battlefield's greatest assets, courage and elite skill, into irrelevancies. It demonstrated a cold, almost industrial logic in defense, processing the threat not through chaotic battle, but through a step-by-step procedure of isolation and elimination. This trap asked the most dispassionate question of all: why fight an army when you can simply and systematically make it disappear? The portcullis crushed chamber processed threats with a chilling, industrial logic, but the castle's most iconic silhouette held a promise of constant, looming violence. Those stone boxes jutting out from the tops of walls and towers, the Machicolations, were far more than decorative battlements. They were permanent artillery platforms, engineered to turn gravity itself into a precise and relentless weapon. Unlike the hidden murder holes cut into ceilings, Machicolations were a bold, architectural declaration. Their overhanging design, supported by sturdy corbels, created a gallery that extended the defender's reach right over the vertical face of the wall. The floor of this gallery was not solid stone, it was punctuated with regular, gaping openings. From the safety of the wall walk behind them, soldiers could step forward, peer down through these gaps and see the attackers directly below, scrambling at the very foundation they were trying to undermine. This vantage point transformed defense from a horizontal struggle into a vertical hunt. The munitions of choice here were weight and mass. Large, rounded stones were stockpiled specifically for this purpose, each one a potential wrecking ball. When dropped from such a height, the kinetic energy was catastrophic. A well-aimed stone could shatter the wooden frame of a siege ladder in an instant, sending a climber plummeting. It could crush the protective roof of a battering ram, disabling the crew within and leaving the heavy log a vulnerable, stationary target. Against men, the effect was both physically devastating and psychologically shattering. The sound alone was a weapon, a deep, thunderous impact that echoed off the stone, signaling a threat that no shield could block and no armor could withstand. The psychological terror was akin to enduring modern, plunging artillery fire, a sense that death could fall from the sky at any moment without warning, delivered from a source that looked down upon you with cold, architectural indifference. This constant, visible threat reshaped the entire experience of assault. It meant that the base of the wall, the very place an army needed to be to do its work, was the most dangerous zone of all. The machicolated silhouette, so familiar in storybooks, was not just imposing, it was actively, perpetually hostile, a constant reminder that every inch gained was still under the shadow of a falling sky. The crushing weight from the Machicolations above made every step at the base of the wall a gamble, but sometimes the most effective defense required no falling stones at all, only a subtle shift in the very surface underfoot. In the dead of a winter siege, under a sky heavy with cold, defenders performed a quiet, almost ritualistic act. They would haul buckets of water to the tops of vulnerable walls and pour it steadily down the sloping faces of stone approaches and along the treads of crucial staircases. As the temperature plummeted overnight, that water underwent a magical and malicious transformation. By dawn, what had been rough, climbable stone was now sheathed in a continuous, glass-smooth carapace of ice. To an attacking force, this was an insurmountable puzzle written in physics. Siege ladders would find no purchase, skidding helplessly down the frozen surface. Men attempting to scale ropes or claw their way up a breach would discover their fingers and boots sliding off the unyielding, frigid glaze. The simple act of walking across a battlement or courtyard became a perilous ballet, where a single misstep could send a fully armored soldier crashing to the ground with bone-jolting force. The alternative, used in any season, was equally humiliating and effective. Great vats of rendered animal fat, a byproduct of the castle's kitchens, could be heated and poured across stone pathways, gatehouse floors, and the steps of spiral staircases. This created a clinging, slippery film that turned confident charges into chaotic, comical scrambles. The strategic beauty of these methods lay in their profound simplicity and psychological impact. They weaponized the environment without a single arrow being knocked or a single rock being lifted. A commander watching his best troops reduced to stumbling, frustrated individuals, their momentum shattered not by brave defenders but by an invisible film on the stone, faced a unique form of demoralization. It was a reminder that the castle was not just a collection of walls, but an entity deeply integrated with its surroundings, capable of turning the very weather and the most mundane substances into loyal, silent sentries. This trap asked a question that eroded confidence at its core. How do you conquer a fortress that has made a pact with the ground itself to betray you? The ice and grease transformed the ground into a treacherous ally, but the war beneath the surface demanded an even more radical sacrifice. In the suffocating darkness of the countermine, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the sound of muffled picks, a defender might face a terrible choice. The enemy sapper gallery was detected, but it was too deep, too well supported, or too close to a critical wall to safely intercept and collapse in a direct fight. When the standard countermine could not succeed, the defenders would turn to a strategy of deliberate, controlled destruction. They would not dig to meet their enemy, but to become a ceiling over them. Working with frantic, silent precision, they would hollow out a chamber directly above the advancing enemy tunnel. But this new space was not meant to be a platform for attack. It was engineered to be a funeral pyre. Its ceiling was deliberately thinned and weakened, a calculated structural flaw. Then, this hollowed earth would be packed not with stone, but with the most combustible materials the garrison could spare: dry straw, bundles of firewood, barrels of pitch, and casks of oil. It became a subterranean tinderbox, a bomb buried in the castle's own foundations. When the moment was right, a brave soul would touch a torch to the kindling, and then scramble back through the narrow passage as the flames took hold with a hungry roar. The fire would spread with terrifying speed in the confined, oxygen-rich space, consuming the supports and licking at the weakened ceiling. Then, with a deep, grinding groan felt through the very bones of the castle, the earth would give way. Tons of superheated soil, stone, and burning debris would collapse downward, burying the enemy sappers and their tunnel in an instant fiery tomb. This was a scorched earth tactic brought to the world beneath the earth, a willingness to sacrifice a part of the castle's own subterranean body to save the whole structure above. It demonstrated a chilling calculus of survival, where the preservation of the community within the walls justified the most profound and dangerous alterations to the ground upon which it stood. This trap asked the ultimate question of subterranean warfare: what are you prepared to burn, even of your own home, to ensure the darkness below never reaches the light above? Silence could be a weapon, but so could its deliberate, terrifying absence. After the subterranean fires and the grinding collapse of stone, an army besieging a castle faced a new kind of exhaustion, one that frayed the nerves rather than the body. In the dead of night, when the world should have been still, the fortress would suddenly come alive with a cacophony of manufactured chaos. Defenders high on the walls would begin a relentless, rhythmic pounding on great war drums, their deep, resonant booms echoing across the encampment like a monstrous, irregular heartbeat. Horns would blare from different towers in a discordant chorus, and soldiers would shout orders to phantom units, their voices carrying on the cold air. This was not communication, it was theater, a carefully staged performance of strength and menace. Simultaneously, lights would appear and vanish in a bewildering pattern. Torches flared along empty sections of the battlements only to be extinguished moments later, while new ones sparked to life on the opposite side. The flickering glow suggested movement, the mustering of troops, the preparation for a night sortie that never came. For the weary soldier trying to sleep in a muddy tent, this sensory assault was torture. Every drumbeat was a potential signal for an attack, every distant shout a command he could not understand. The lights dancing on the walls painted pictures of reinforcements and shifting defenses, making the castle seem not like a static target, but a living, breathing entity that was watching them and actively preparing to strike. This psychological warfare targeted the most vulnerable resource in any prolonged siege: the mind's ability to rest and maintain resolve. It cultivated a pervasive state of anxiety, ensuring that even in their moments of respite, the attackers were never truly at ease. The constant alertness drained morale as effectively as any shortage of rations, turning the cover of darkness from a time for recovery into a prolonged exercise in dread. This 25th and final ingenious trap required no moving parts, no complex engineering, only a deep understanding of human fear. It demonstrated that the ultimate defense was not always a stronger wall, but the ability to craft an illusion of overwhelming, unpredictable power. The greatest fortress, in the end, was often the one built from the uncertainty in the mind of the attacker, a citadel of doubt that could hold an entire army captive long before its physical gates were ever tested. The relentless drumbeats and flickering torches were a final lesson in psychological dominion. proving that the most enduring fortress is often the one built in the mind of an enemy. Yet the true legacy of these 25 ingenious systems extends far beyond the stone walls and dark passages of the medieval world. Each trap, from the simple caltrop to the complex Portcullis crush chamber, represented a sophisticated fusion of disciplines we would separate today. They were applied physics using gravity, momentum, and geometry as weapons. They were early psychology, expertly manipulating fear, expectation, and perception. They were materials science, transforming everyday substances like sand, pitch, and water into agents of chaos. This was not random brutality, but calculated engineering born from the most intense pressure imaginable, the need to survive against overwhelming force. That pressure forged innovations that would echo for centuries, shaping the evolution of military architecture long after the age of castles had passed. The angular bastions of the Renaissance Star Fort, designed to eliminate blind spots and create overlapping fields of fire, were a direct intellectual descendant of the killing ground and the angled arrow slit. The layered defense of a modern secure perimeter, with its clear zones, surveillance, and controlled access points, follows the same fundamental principle as the medieval philosophy of defense in depth. We still study these ancient systems not for their cruelty, but for their brilliant problem-solving logic. They offer a profound window into the values and resources of a society defined by conflict. Every choice of material, from boiling oil to heated sand, speaks to an economy of scarcity and a deep knowledge of the local environment. Every architectural trick reveals a community's collective intelligence, its relentless drive to protect the home and hearth with whatever means creativity could provide. In their cold, mechanical efficiency, we connect with the strategic minds of the past, individuals who looked at a landscape, a pile of stone, and a barrel of tar, and saw not just a shelter, but a labyrinth of consequences for any who dared approach. Their legacy is a powerful testament to a universal truth that human ingenuity, when cornered, does not merely build walls. It designs experiences, crafts dilemmas, and engineers reality itself into a shield. The true legacy of these fortresses is not measured in fallen stone, but in the enduring principles they carved into history. Each chilling mechanism, from the crushing portcullis to the silent caltrop, was a chapter in a manual on human conflict, written in iron and stone. These were not static shelters, but reactive, thinking entities engineered to process aggression through a cold calculus of physics and fear. They transformed the simple act of approaching a wall into a gauntlet of impossible choices, where every victory was a potential prelude to a greater defeat. The stories embedded in their design speak of a relentless drive to protect, a testament to communities who used every scrap of knowledge and material to turn their home into a labyrinth of consequences. This was engineering born from absolute necessity, where creativity became the ultimate currency of survival. As we look back, the echoes of these ancient strategies are unmistakable in our modern world. The layered security of a data network, the controlled access of a high-tech facility, even the psychological deterrence of a visible alarm system, all follow the foundational logic of defense in depth first perfected in medieval gatehouses and killing grounds. The goal remains unchanged: to shape behavior, to channel threats, and to protect what lies within by making the cost of entry unthinkably high. These 25 ingenious traps remind us that the greatest defenses are often those that engage the mind long before they ever test the body. They invite us to see history not as a collection of dusty ruins, but as a living conversation about resilience, innovation, and the profound lengths to which people will go to safeguard their future. If this exploration into the cunning intellect behind castle walls captivated you, there are countless more stories of hidden engineering waiting to be uncovered. Your curiosity fuels this journey, so share your thoughts below. Which of these ancient defenses left you most astonished? And join us next time as we delve deeper into the forgotten blueprints of history.